He carried a small cold stone in his coat for 11 days, unable to find a moment large enough. She did not yet know her name was already engraved inside it. One December, 2 enemies became something neither could name. We begin this story now. The library at Malfoy Manor breathed differently after midnight. The candles in their silver sconces had burned low, and the wax pooled in slow, deliberate tears down the brass. And the fire in the great marble hearth had long since collapsed into its own embers, throwing a copper light that did not quite reach the corners. The corners kept their secrets. They always had. Draco Malfoy stood at the long mullioned window with one hand pressed flat against the cold glass and the other curled knuckles bone white around something small inside his coat pocket. 11 days. For 11 days he had carried it. Through breakfast meetings at Gringotts, where his mind drifted in the middle of a goblin sentence. Through a tedious afternoon at the ministry, where Kingsley had asked him twice if he was unwell. Through every supper he had taken across from her, every walk through the autumn-stripped gardens, every quiet evening when she had curled against his side with a book balanced on her knees and her dark hair loose over his shoulder. 11 days, and not once had the moment offered itself, and not once had he found the courage to seize it. He drew the ring from his pocket now and held it up against the candle glow. It had belonged to his grandmother. Not the cold one, the one with the portrait that still scolded him for posture, but the other, the soft-handed grandmother on his mother's side, who had smelled of bergamot and pressed sugared violets into his palm when no one was looking. She had died when he was 7. The ring was a small, strange thing for a black heirloom, a single oval moonstone set in old white gold, no diamonds, no serpents, no theatrics. It looked like nothing so much as a held breath. Hermione would like it because it was quiet. Hermione would say yes. Hermione would, perhaps, say yes. He closed his hand around the stone and felt the metal warm against his palm, and thought, with a sudden plummet behind his sternum, that he had never in his life been so frightened of anything. The door opened behind him. He did not turn. He knew her footstep. He had known it for almost 2 years now. The particular weight of her, slightly faster than most women her height, slightly heavier on the heel because she walked the way she argued, decisive and without apology. The library door clicked shut. The faint hush of slippers on the Aubusson runner. The pause as she registered the dim, the candles, the fact of him at the window. "You weren't in bed," she said. "No. It's gone too. I know." She came closer. He could see her now in the dark of the glass, ghosted against his own reflection. Barefoot, her dressing gown belted hastily, her hair a clouded silhouette around her face. She had been asleep. There was a crease from the pillow still printed on her cheek. The sight of it undid him in a way nothing more elegant ever could. "Draco?" Her voice was careful. "What is it?" He turned. The ring was still in his closed hand. He had not planned this. He had spent 11 nights composing the speech, and now, looking at her in her crumpled dressing gown with the pillow crease on her face, every prepared word emptied out of him like water from a tipped basin. "Sit down," he heard himself say. "You're alarming me." "Please." She sat, not in the great wing-backed chair where she usually read, but on the low Persian footstool by the dying fire, the way she had sat on her first night in this house, as though she was still uncertain whether the furniture would tolerate her. The candlelight caught the side of her face and made gold of her temple and the curve of her throat above the dressing-gown collar. He did not sit. He could not have managed sitting. He went and knelt instead on the rug in front of her, and the gesture was so unrehearsed and so absurd that for one terrible second he thought she might laugh, and if she laughed, he did not know what he would do. She did not laugh. She went very still. "Draco, don't speak yet." He opened his palm. The moonstone caught the firelight and threw a thin, watery shimmer across her knee. She made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound someone makes when the breath leaves them too quickly to shape. "I have been carrying this," he said. And his voice was not steady, and he did not try to steady it, because there was no point pretending to be a composed man in front of the only person on earth who had ever seen him uncomposed. For 11 days. "I have been carrying it through every room of this house, and I have been waiting for a moment that felt large enough, worthy enough. I kept thinking, at dinner, perhaps, with the silver out, or at the fountain in the south garden, or under the apple trees when they fruited, except they did not fruit this year. They did almost nothing this year. And I think I knew even then that I was lying to myself, that I was waiting because I was afraid, and not because there was any moment in this world that could possibly be large enough for what I wanted to ask you." She was looking at the ring. Her hand had risen halfway to her mouth and stopped there, fingers trembling against her lower lip. "Hermione." He had to look at the rug for a second before he could go on. The pattern blurred. I have not been. For most of my life, I was not the kind of man who deserved to ask this of anyone. You know that. You knew it better than I did for a long time. And I am not going to stand in this room and pretend that everything I have done is undone, because it isn't, and you, of all people, would not want me to pretend. But I will tell you that every morning for the last 18 months, I have woken up in a house that did not feel like a tomb, because you were in it. And I will tell you that I do not know what I have done with my hours before you, because the hours did not seem to count. And His voice caught. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye for a moment, ferociously, and then made himself look up at her. She was crying, silently, without sound, the way she always cried, tears moving down the unmoving plane of her face like rain down a window pane. "Marry me," he said. She did not answer at once. For one cavernous second, the room held nothing but the small wet sound of the candle and the faint settling of an ember in the grate. And Draco felt the whole architecture of his life balance on the silence and prepare to fall. Then she slid off the footstool onto her knees in front of him and took his face in both her hands. Her palms were cold from the corridor, her thumbs pressed against his cheekbones. She brought her forehead to his and held it there, and he could feel her breath shaking in and out against his mouth. And he closed his eyes because he could not bear to see her clearly at this distance and survive it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, you ridiculous, beautiful man, yes." He laughed. It was wrenched out of him, half a sob, and she laughed too against his face, and he found the third finger of her left hand without looking and slid the moonstone onto it. And when she lifted her hand to look at it, her wrist trembled so badly that the firelight skittered across the stone like a small struck flame. He kissed her then, not the way he had kissed her 1,000 times before, not the slow Sunday morning kiss, not the goodbye at the flue kiss, not the hungry late evening kiss against the doorframe. He kissed her the way a drowning man takes air, with his whole face, with his whole life, with both hands buried in the heavy weight of her hair, and his mouth open against hers, and the salt of her crying on his tongue. She made a sound into his mouth that he would remember for the rest of his life. She tasted of sleep, and of tea, and of yes, and he thought very clearly through the roar of it, I have not survived this. I will not survive this. I do not want to. They knelt there together on the library rug for a long time. The candles guttered. The fire fell another inch into its bed of ashes. Outside the great window, somewhere over the dark Wiltshire fields, an owl cried once and was answered. At length, she drew back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were enormous in the dimness. The moonstone glimmered on her hand, where it rested against his throat. "When?" she said, hoarse. "When you like." "Soon. Tomorrow, if you say it." She laughed, wet and breathless. "Your mother would have a fit." "Let her." "Draco." "Let her," he said again, and meant it, and kissed the inside of her wrist where the pulse jumped. She lowered her head against his shoulder. He felt her exhale, long and shuddering, into the open collar of his shirt. His hand moved up her back of its own accord and settled at the nape of her neck, where the small soft hairs curled damp against his fingers, and he held her there as if she might dissolve if he loosened his grip by a single degree. "I love you," she said, into the hollow of his throat. "I love you so much, it frightens me." "I know. You don't sound frightened." "I am terrified," he said. "I have never been anything else with you. I am simply tired of pretending otherwise." She made a small choked sound that was almost laughter and pressed her mouth against his pulse. They went to bed eventually when the last candle had burned down to nothing and only the ember glow remained. He carried her up the great staircase, though she was perfectly capable of walking, and she did not protest, only locked her arms around his neck and watched his face the whole way as though committing it to memory. The moonstone caught the wall sconces as they passed and flashed soft and silver against the panelling. He laid her down on the bed and lay down beside her, fully dressed, and they did not sleep for a long time, only lay facing each other with their hands joined between them, and the ring, a small, cool weight against his palm where her fingers curled into his. At some point, very late, she said his name in the dark. He answered with the smallest tightening of his hand. She did not say anything more. She did not need to. He was still holding her hand when grey began at the edges of the heavy curtains. He was still holding it when the first owl arrived, tapping at the bedroom window with a thin cream-coloured envelope clamped in its beak. An envelope sealed in dark green wax, stamped with the Malfoy crest, addressed in his mother's unmistakable hand. He saw it. He registered it. He did not, in that moment, move to take it. He only turned his face into Hermione's hair and breathed her in once more, deeply, like a man storing something against a long winter. Then he reached for the latch. The envelope lay on the breakfast table between them, like a small, unexploded thing. Hermione had eaten nothing. She had buttered a slice of toast some minutes ago and then forgotten about it, and now the butter was congealing in a pale, uneven smear, and the toast had gone the colour of old parchment at the edges. Her tea sat untouched at her elbow, faintly steaming, faintly trembling, the cup vibrating in its saucer in a way she was almost certain was not the cup's doing. Draco sat opposite her with his long fingers laced loosely around his own cup, and his face composed in the particular blank arrangement he wore when something inside him was being held very still by force of will. The thin morning light from the orangery windows fell across him sideways and turned his hair to the colour of struck flint. He had not opened the letter yet. He was waiting for her, she realized. He was waiting for her to be ready. She would not be ready, not in any meaningful sense. She drew a breath that did not go quite as deep as she wanted it to, and reached across the linen. "Give it here," she said. "Hermione." "Give it here, Draco. Sitting and looking at it isn't going to soften whatever's inside." He passed it to her. Their fingers brushed in the handover, and she felt the small static prickle of his magic against hers. That low hum she had grown so used to, the one that lived under his skin and answered hers like a tuning fork. And she allowed herself to take comfort from it for exactly one breath before she broke the seal. The wax cracked cleanly, dark green, embossed with the M, sharp as a tooth. The parchment inside was thick and softly creamy, the sort that had to be ordered from a particular shop in Diagon Alley that had served the family for 9 generations. Narcissa Malfoy's handwriting filled it. Tall, slanted, beautifully even, the letters precise enough to have been ruled. "My dearest Draco, I had your news from the South Wing house elf at 7:30 this morning. I confess myself moved. I have, for some time now, suspected the direction of your affections, and I will not pretend that the suspicion did not give me pause. But I am, before anything else, your mother, and your happiness has been the single uncompromised desire of my life. If she is the means of it, then she has my regard, however unfamiliar the shape of that regard must necessarily be. I write, however, on a matter of practical urgency. You will both be aware that the engagement of a Malfoy heir is not, and has never been, a private undertaking. The wizarding world will require an announcement. Our peerage will require a ball. Our house will require that certain 7th-century-old observances be honoured in the form prescribed by tradition. I enclose the list. I trust you will understand that none of it is optional. I have already engaged Madame Twilfit for the bridal fittings, reserved the Manor's East Ballroom for the 2nd Saturday in December, and written to your great-aunt Walburga's portrait for the recitation of the lineage, which she will, I am told, condescend to perform. Bring Miss Granger to tea on Thursday at 4. We have a great deal to discuss. Your loving mother, Narcissa. Beneath the letter, folded in thirds, was a second sheet. Hermione unfolded it. The list ran to 2 full pages. She read it once in silence. Then she read it again, more slowly, her eyes catching now on this line, now on that, her free hand tightening progressively around the napkin in her lap until the linen had bunched into a small white-knuckled fist. The bridal robes must be commissioned in the traditional sequence of 7 fittings, the first to take place no fewer than 30 days before the ceremony of betrothal. The intended bride must be presented to the assembled peerage in the gown of first appearance, which by precedent shall be palest cream silk, overlaid with Belgian lace of no fewer than 4 centuries' age. The recitation of the lineage shall be performed in full from the founding of the line under Armand Malfoy, and the intended bride shall stand in silence throughout, neither speaking nor seating herself until the recitation concludes. The blood acknowledgement. The matriarch of the receiving house shall, by ancient rite, take the hand of the intended and... Hermione stopped reading. She set the parchment down on the table beside her cold tea. She smoothed it once with the flat of her palm, very carefully, as though she was straightening a thing that might otherwise leap up and bite her. Then she folded her hands in her lap on top of the crumpled napkin and looked across the breakfast table at the man she had agreed, less than 10 hours ago, to marry. "Draco," she said. "I am going to kill her," he said, conversational, eyes on the toast rack. "I am going to walk upstairs, and I am going to wring my own mother's neck." "Draco." "I told her. I wrote to her 2 months ago. I specifically wrote to her that whatever happened, whenever it happened, we would do it our own way. We would do it small. We would do it... Draco." He stopped. She kept her voice very level. It was the voice she had used in the Wizengamot last winter, when she had argued for the restoration of house elf rights against a panel of men who had not wanted to hear her. It was a voice she had had to teach herself, slowly, with a great deal of effort, over a great many years. "It is the standing of antique lace," she said, "that I find I cannot get past." He looked at her then, properly. His grey eyes had gone the colour they went when he was about to do something rash. "We don't have to do any of it, don't we?" "No, we don't. I will write to her now. I will send the bloody bird back with a note that says we are eloping to a registry office in Devon, and she may read about it in the Prophet like everybody else." "Draco." "What?" "Sit down. You are already sitting. I mean it metaphorically. Sit down inside yourself." He drew a breath. He let it out. He picked up his cup, found his tea had gone cold, set it down again with a small porcelain click that was the only sound in the room for several seconds. "All right," he said. "It is not," she said, "that I cannot wear cream silk. I can wear cream silk. I can stand in silence through a recitation of dead Malfoys. I have stood in silence through worse. It is..." She broke off. She pressed her fingertips against the inner corners of her eyes for a moment, and then took her hand away. "It is the assumption, Draco. It is the assumption embedded in every line of that document that I am a vessel, that I am being received, that I am being checked like a parcel for the correct dimensions, and that if I am found wanting in any single particular, the entire transaction may be quietly returned to sender. I know. Do you?" "Yes." His jaw worked. "Yes, I know. I grew up inside that document, Hermione. I know every comma in it." "Then why?" "Because she thinks she is being generous." He looked away towards the long windows where the autumn light was turning thin and silver. "Because in her mind she has bent further to accommodate you than her own mother bent to accommodate her. Because in her mind the letter you have just read was an act of welcome." "It does not feel like welcome." "No, I did not imagine it would." Silence opened between them. Not the easy silence of the early morning when they had lain in the half-dark and held hands and not needed to speak. A taut silence, ribbed through with something that had not been in the room half an hour ago. Hermione became aware of her own pulse in her throat, of the small weight of the moonstone on her finger, of the faint ozone after rain scent that always hung around him in the mornings before he had put on his cologne. She looked down at the ring. She had been looking at it, off and on, all morning. Every time she had reached for the teapot, every time she had turned a page of the prophet, every time her hand had passed across the surface of the table in any direction at all. It was the first object she had ever owned, she realized, that she instinctively kept checking on, as though it might have vanished while she was not paying attention. It had not vanished. It was sitting on her finger, catching the orangery light, a small, impossible piece of his grandmother on her hand. She closed her fingers around it. "We are going to Thursday tea," she said. "Hermione." "We are going to Thursday tea, Draco. I am not going to begin our engagement by hiding from your mother. I am not going to begin it by letting her hand me a list and watching you set fire to the list on my behalf. I am going to go to her drawing room, and I am going to sit on her terrible little gilt chair, and I am going to drink her terrible little cup of tea, and I am going to discuss her terrible little list with her, line by line, until she and I have arrived at something I can survive standing inside of." He was watching her now with an expression she could not quite name. It was not pride exactly. It was something older and more bruised than pride. It was the look of a man who had been told 100 times in his life that he did not deserve anything good, and who was watching in real time the proof that he had been told wrong. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I know I don't. I will be in the room. I know. I will not leave you in the room with her without me. I want you to understand that. Whatever else this engagement is going to require of either of us, I will not leave you in any room of this house without me. Not for tea, not for fittings, not for the recitation of one single dead Malfoy. Do you understand?" She looked at him. Her throat had gone tight. "Yes," she said. He reached across the breakfast table. She gave him her hand, the left, the one with the ring, and he turned it palm up and pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, where the blue vein ran shallow under the skin, and held his lips there for a long moment with his eyes closed. She felt his breath warm against her pulse. She felt the faint scrape of stubble he had not yet shaved. She felt, beneath everything, the steady, answering hum of his magic threaded into hers, the low, constant note that meant here, here, still here. When he lifted his head, his eyes were wet. He did not pretend they weren't. "Thursday at 4, he said. "Thursday at 4. She withdrew her hand slowly and folded the letter back into its envelope and set it, with great precision, beside the toast rack. The orangery light shifted as a cloud moved over the sun, and for a moment the table and the porcelain and the man across from her all dimmed together into a softer grey, and then the light came back, and everything was edged in gold again, and the second Saturday in December was suddenly, terribly, very close. She picked up her cold tea. She drank a small swallow of it without flinching. She set the cup down. "Right," she said. He almost smiled. He did not quite manage it, but the corner of his mouth lifted in the way that, after 18 months, she had learned to read as everything he could not yet bring himself to say aloud. And she lifted her own cup in answer, and outside the orangery windows, the first thin rain of the morning began to strike the glass. Thursday came in the colour of pewter. The rain had not stopped since Tuesday. It moved across the Wiltshire Downs in slow grey sheets, soaking the lawns, blackening the gravel of the long drive, gathering in small pewter pools between the flagstones of the south terrace. Hermione stood at her dressing-room window and watched a leaf detach itself from the great copper beech and travel, slowly, in a spiralling fall to the wet ground. She had been watching the leaf for some minutes. She had been avoiding the mirror for slightly longer. Behind her, on the dressing table, the small enamelled clock chimed the quarter. 4:15. She turned at last. The gown the house elf had laid out for her was not the cream silk. That horror was still to come, in a fitting room in Diagon Alley in 2 weeks' time. But a softer thing of dove-grey wool with a high collar and small mother-of-pearl buttons running from throat to waist. Narcissa had sent it over yesterday morning by owl with a note that read only for tea. N. No salutation, no softening. Just the gown and the 2 letters. Hermione had hated intensely that the gown fit. She had hated more that, fastened up to her throat and belted at the waist, it made her look like a woman of consequence, like a woman one would take seriously across a tea table, like a woman who might, after all, belong inside a Malfoy drawing room without setting off any of the wards. She turned from the mirror before she could think about that for too long. Draco was waiting for her at the top of the staircase. He had dressed without ceremony, dark trousers, a charcoal waistcoat, a white shirt open at the collar. But his hair was combed back from his forehead in the careful way that meant he too was nervous, and the small muscle in his jaw was doing the slow, tight clench it did when he was holding something in. He held out his hand to her without speaking. She took it. They went down the great staircase together in silence. The portraits on the long landing watched them go, some with open curiosity, some with the mild affront of ancestors who had not yet decided whether the new arrangement met with their approval. Hermione kept her chin up and her eyes forward, and her hand in his. Narcissa's drawing room was on the first floor, in the south wing, behind a pair of doors of cream-painted wood with very small gilt mouldings. Draco stopped in front of them. He looked at Hermione for a long second without speaking. Then he raised her hand to his mouth, kissed the moonstone on her finger once, and pushed the door open. The drawing room smelled of bergamot and lily of the valley, and the faint, dry paper scent of very old books. Narcissa was already seated on the cream silk sofa beside the fire. She did not rise. She was a small woman, slighter than Hermione had remembered, dressed in deep slate blue, her pale hair drawn back into a soft chignon at the nape of her neck. Her hands were folded in her lap. On the low table before her, the tea things were already laid. A savoury pot, 3 cups, a small silver tray of madeleines, a cut-glass dish of lemon slices the colour of pale gold. "Draco," her voice was level. "Miss Granger, please sit down." Hermione sat. The chair she had been given was a low, gilt-armed thing with a tapestry seat. She arranged her skirts. She set her hands in her lap, one over the other, the moonstone resting against her knuckles. She did not look at the tea tray. She looked at Narcissa. Narcissa looked back. For a moment that felt distinctly longer than a moment, the only sound in the drawing room was the small wet drumming of the rain against the long sash windows and the discreet ticking of a porcelain clock on the mantel. Then Narcissa lifted the teapot. "Lemon or milk, Miss Granger?" "Lemon, thank you." The tea poured into the cup with a thin, clean sound. Narcissa added a slice of lemon with the silver tongs, set the cup on its saucer, and slid it across the low table towards Hermione with 2 fingers. Her nails were buffed to a soft pink shine. There was a single ring on her right hand, a square-cut sapphire, and as her hand moved, the stone caught the light from the fire and threw a brief blue flicker across the tea tray. "Draco. Black, Mother. Thank you." Another cup, another small click of porcelain on porcelain. Narcissa poured her own last, added a single slice of lemon, returned the pot to its trivet, folded her hands again in her lap. She had not yet looked away from Hermione. Her eyes were a paler, colder grey than her son's, almost silver in the dim afternoon light, and they did not blink as often as Hermione's eyes wished they would. "I trust," Narcissa said, "that you received my letter." "I did." "And the enclosure?" "Yes." "You have, I imagine, read it." "Twice." Narcissa inclined her head a fraction of a degree. "And?" Hermione picked up her teacup. She held it for a moment in both hands, feeling the heat of it press through the bone china against her fingers. She did not drink. She set the cup down again, very gently in its saucer. "Mrs. Malfoy," she said, and was pleased to find that her voice was perfectly steady. "I should like to thank you for your letter. I should like to thank you also for the welcome which I understand it to have been intended to convey. And I should like, with respect, to discuss several of the items on the enclosed list." Narcissa did not move. The silver eyes did not blink. "Indeed, indeed." A silence. Draco, beside Hermione on the small settee, did not speak. He had set his tea down untasted. His hand, lying open on his knee, was perhaps half an inch from her own. He did not move it closer. He did not need to. She could feel the heat of it through the dove-grey wool of her sleeve. "Pray begin," Narcissa said. "The recitation of the lineage," Hermione said. "I have no objection to standing in silence while it is performed. I have, however, a question concerning its content. I am told that the recitation traces the line from Armand Malfoy forward, name by name, generation by generation. Is that correct?" "It is." "And does the recitation include, for completeness, those marriages and those branches of the line which have, historically, been struck from the family tapestry?" The porcelain clock on the mantel ticked 4 times before Narcissa answered. "It does not." "Then I should like to ask," said Hermione very politely, "whether an exception might be made, on this occasion, for the inclusion of Andromeda." The drawing room went absolutely still. Hermione did not look away. She had thought about this for 2 nights running. She had not told Draco she was going to say it. She had not been certain, until the moment of opening her mouth, that she was going to say it at all. But she had said it now, and she would not unsay it. And she kept her eyes on Narcissa's face and watched a small, very precise muscle work, once at the corner of the older woman's mouth. Beside her, Draco had gone perfectly motionless. She could feel him not breathing. "My sister," Narcissa said, "is not a Malfoy. No, she is a Black, as are you, as, by descent, is Draco. I am told that on the occasion of a Malfoy betrothal, the recitation traditionally honours both lines. You have done your reading. I have. How thorough. I am told I have a reputation for it." Another silence. Narcissa's small hand lifted, very slowly, and adjusted the position of the silver tongs by perhaps a quarter of an inch on the tea tray. The gesture was so contained, so disciplined, that it gave away nothing at all, which itself, Hermione thought, gave away a great deal. "You ask a difficult thing, Miss Granger." "I know I do. My sister and I have not spoken in 37 years. I know that also. Then you will forgive me if I am not asking you," Hermione said, gently but without yielding, to reconcile with her. "I am asking that her name and the name of her late husband and the name of her daughter who died at the Battle of Hogwarts be included in the recitation of your son's lineage on the night of his engagement. That is all. Whether you choose to invite her in person, whether you choose ever to write to her, is entirely a matter for you. I am asking only that, on the night that your son binds himself in the presence of 7 centuries of his ancestors to a Muggle-born witch, the recitation acknowledge that he is not the first in his family to choose love against the expectations of the line. I think, Mrs. Malfoy, I think it would be a kindness to him. I think it might also be a kindness to you." She stopped. She had not meant to say so much. The last sentence had escaped her before she had been able to weigh it. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on Narcissa's face, and did not allow her shoulders to rise even a fraction with the breath she now badly needed to take. Narcissa did not answer at once. She lifted her own teacup. She drank a small swallow, set the cup down, dabbed once at the corner of her mouth with the linen napkin from her lap. She refolded the napkin. She placed it beside her saucer. Her movements were as exact as a watchmaker's. When at last she raised her eyes again to Hermione, the silver of them had altered very slightly. Not softened exactly, but darkened, as a polished surface darkens when something is breathed against it. "I shall consider it," she said. "Thank you. I have not said yes. No, you have said you will consider it. I am grateful. You are a very direct young woman. I have been told so. Frequently, I imagine. With some regularity." A very faint thing happened at the corner of Narcissa's mouth. It was not a smile. It was not even the suggestion of a smile. It was, perhaps, the suggestion of the possibility of the eventual suggestion of a smile, several years from now, under unusually favourable conditions. Hermione registered it with a small private flare somewhere beneath her sternum, and gave no outward sign of having seen it at all. Beside her, Draco breathed out. It was the first proper breath he had taken in several minutes. She felt the warmth of it move past her ear. "Now," Narcissa said, picking up the teapot again. "The matter of the lace. I am told the Belgian houses are unable to supply, on the timeline required, anything older than the late 17th century, which is of course wholly inadequate. I have therefore written to a private collection in Bruges." She refilled Hermione's cup without asking. The rain went on against the long windows, and under the low gilt arm of the chair, where Narcissa could not see it, Draco's hand had finally moved that last half-inch and laced its fingers through Hermione's. The moonstone caught warm and steady between their joined palms, and he did not let go for the rest of the afternoon. The Daily Prophet arrived at 7:20 on Friday morning, and the owl that brought it would not stay for the customary nut. Hermione noticed that first. The bird, a small grey post owl with one feather missing from its left wing, dropped the rolled paper onto the breakfast table with an unceremonious thump, took 2 hops backward across the linen, eyed her with what looked very much like apology, and was out through the orangery window before she had finished pouring her tea. "That," said Draco from behind his coffee cup, "is not a promising sign. No. Perhaps don't open it. Don't be absurd." She unrolled the paper. The front page held a photograph that took up nearly 2/3 of the space above the fold. It was a photograph she did not, at first, recognize as a photograph of herself. And then, with a small drop somewhere low in her stomach, she did. It had been taken on Wednesday afternoon outside Twilfit and Tatting's, where she had gone alone, briefly to look at fabric swatches before the formal fittings began. She had been wearing a perfectly ordinary navy coat. Her hair had been pinned up. She was, in the photograph, in the act of stepping over a puddle, one gloved hand lifting the hem of her coat, her face caught in profile in a small, private half-smile. The headline above the photograph read, in letters 2 inches high, "The Mudblood and the Death Eater's Son. Granger to wed Malfoy heir in December. Sources within the family in despair." Underneath, in smaller letters, "Exclusive by Rita Skeeter." Hermione set down her tea. She did not say anything. She read the article. She read it once, quickly, the way one reads an unpleasant medical report, gathering the shape of it before going back for the particulars. Then she read it a second time, more slowly. Then she folded the paper in half, very neatly, and set it down beside her plate and pressed her napkin to her mouth for a moment, as though she were dabbing away crumbs. Draco was watching her. "Hermione." "In a moment." "Hermione, give me the—" "In a moment, Draco. Please." He waited. She lowered the napkin. She drew a slow, careful breath. She picked up the paper again and passed it across the table to him without a word. She watched his face as he read. She had thought, when she first met him at 11, that his face was a closed thing, a small white shutter behind which nothing of consequence ever moved. She had thought, at 15, that his face was a stage on which a great deal of poor acting was being performed. She had thought, at 17, in the cold drawing room of this very house, that his face was the worst thing she had ever been forced to look at. She knew his face now. She knew it the way one knows a piece of music one has lived inside of. She watched the small alterations of it as he read, the very slight whitening of his nostrils, the almost imperceptible shift of the muscle at the hinge of his jaw, the way his eyes did not move down the column in the usual reading rhythm, but stopped at certain lines and stayed there, fractionally too long, before continuing. When he reached the bottom of the first page, he turned to page 4 without looking up. There were 3 further paragraphs on page 4. He read all 3. He folded the paper closed. He set it down beside his own plate. He looked at her. "I am going," he said, in a voice that had no temperature at all, "to sew her into a pulp. Draco." I am going to sue her, and I am going to sue the editor, and I am going to sue the photographer, and I am going to sue the proprietor of Twilfits for permitting that photograph to be taken on his doorstep. And when I have finished suing them, I am going to find Rita Skeeter wherever she is currently hiding, and I am going to Draco, transfigure her into a ladybird and post her to Azerbaijan. Draco. What? It says she has a source. He stopped. The bright, cold thing that had been in his voice went out like a snuffed candle. It says, Hermione went on, keeping her own voice as flat and clean as she could manage, that the source is, and I quote, a member of the Malfoy domestic staff who has served the family for 31 years. It says the source confirms that your mother is, and again I quote, privately devastated. It says the source confirms that the engagement is, the third quote, bitterly opposed within the family. It says, I know what it says. That the source confirms the existence of an ancient inheritance clause concerning the bridal blood acknowledgement, which, the source suggests, I will be unable to fulfill. Draco. How does Rita Skeeter know about the inheritance clause? He did not answer. He did not answer because there was, she realized, only one possible answer, and they were both arriving at it at the same speed. Mipsy, he said at last, quietly, almost to himself. Who is Mipsy? My mother's personal house elf. Has been since before I was born. Has, for the last several years, been letting her wages be paid into a Gringotts account at her own request. Wages? Since the reforms, yes. Wages which someone might be supplementing. Yes. Hermione closed her eyes. It was not, she thought with a kind of weary, almost amused exhaustion behind her closed lids. It was not even the article that hurt. The article was Rita Skeeter, and Rita Skeeter was a known weather pattern, one prepared for the way one prepared for January cold. It was not even the photograph. It was not even the headline, with its old vicious word she had not been called to her face in nearly 4 years. It was the inheritance clause. She had read about the clause 2 nights ago, in a small green leather-bound volume Draco had reluctantly produced from a locked cabinet in the library after she had pressed him for everything. Everything. Every last item of the 7-century-old apparatus they were now walking into. The clause was on page 341. It was not in the list Narcissa had sent. It read, in the cramped Gothic hand of a long-dead Malfoy notary, and it shall be required of the intended bride, upon the night of betrothal, that she suffer the matriarch of the receiving house to take her hand, and, by the ancient blood rite, acknowledge her as wife-to-be, the blood of the bride mingling in token with the blood of the house. Failing which acknowledgement, no issue of the union shall inherit any portion of the entailed estate. She had read it twice. She had then very carefully closed the book, set it down on the library table, walked the length of the library to the window, and stood with her hands flat against the cold glass for some minutes before she had been able to turn around. Draco had not pressed her. He had only come to stand behind her at the window, not touching, near enough that she could feel the heat of him along the back of her shoulders, and waited. When she had finally turned, she had said only, "We will discuss it tomorrow." They had not discussed it. They had not discussed it yesterday. They had not discussed it last night. They had let the unspoken thing sit between them through dinner and through the long silence of the evening and through the long silence of bed, where she had lain awake until almost 4 in the morning, watching the ceiling and listening to him not sleep beside her. And now Rita Skeeter had printed it on the front page of the Daily Prophet. Hermione opened her eyes. "I will not do it," she said. "I know. I want to be clear, Draco. I want to be very, very clear, because I think you and I have been avoiding this conversation for 48 hours, and I do not propose to avoid it for 1 more minute. I will not do it. I will not stand in your mother's drawing room and let her cut my palm with a silver knife and mix my blood with hers in a porcelain bowl while 200 peers of the wizarding world watch. I will not. Not because I do not love you. Not because I do not honor what your house is, but because in this country, in this century, in this body, I will not be made, in front of witnesses, to bleed for permission. Do you understand me? Yes. Yes? Yes, Hermione. I understand you. Then I will renounce it." She stopped. The orangery had gone very quiet. The grey rain on the glass had thinned to a fine mist. Somewhere outside, a wood pigeon called twice and went silent. "Renounce what?" she said carefully. "The entailed estate." He had not looked away from her. His face was perfectly composed, the way it had been on the morning of the letter, held still by force of will. "The clause cannot be revised. It is older than the ministry. It is older than the wand law. It cannot be amended by petition. I have already inquired. But it can be circumvented, Hermione, because the clause governs only the entailed portion of the estate. The bulk of what my father left, I inherited outright on my majority. The manor, the London house, the Gringotts accounts, the French vineyards, the publishing interests. All of it is mine free and clear, and has been since I was 17. The entailed portion is the original Wiltshire holdings, 600 acres of farmland and the village of Lower Malford, which under the clause cannot pass to a child of mine if we have not. He stopped. He set his coffee cup down very carefully. "It is 600 acres of land, Hermione. It is not us. Let it pass to my cousin's boy. Let it pass to a charitable trust. Let it pass to the crown. I do not want it. I do not want any portion of any inheritance that requires you to bleed in a porcelain bowl to legitimize our children. I will sign the renunciation today. I will sign it before lunch. I will sign it in front of witnesses, and I will have it copied to the Prophet by the 4 o'clock edition so that Rita Skeeter may print that on her front page tomorrow, if it pleases her." Hermione did not speak. She could not speak. She had not expected, she had truly not expected, for him to say it like that, so plainly, so fast. Without the speech, she had thought he would need to give first the long looping speech about duty and lineage, and what it would mean to him to be the man who broke the entail. There had been no speech. He had simply said it in the tone of a man announcing the weather, and now he was watching her across the breakfast table, with his face quiet and his hand open beside his plate, and the Daily Prophet folded between them like a small, unimportant thing. Her eyes filled. She looked down at her hands because she did not want him to see, and then she thought, what nonsense, and looked up again and let him see. "You would do that. I have already done it, inside myself. I did it the moment you said I will not. It is 600 years of land, Draco. It is a field, Hermione. It is a field with sheep on it. I have you." She made a small wet sound that was almost a laugh. He rose then. He came around the breakfast table. He pulled her up out of her chair and into him in one motion, and she went, gladly, fitting her face against the warm white linen of his shirt where it lay open at his throat, and she felt his arms close around her shoulders and his chin come down on the crown of her head, and his breath move slowly out of him into her hair. "They are going to print worse things," he murmured into her hair. "Before December. They are going to print worse than this. I know. I will sue every one of them. You will not, Draco. You will let me sue them. I am better at it." She felt the small huff of his laugh against her temple. She turned her face up. He was looking down at her with eyes that had gone the soft grey they only went in the rooms where no one else was. She lifted onto her toes. He bent. Their mouths met above the folded paper, slow and unhurried, the moonstone catching a thin shaft of orangery light against the back of his neck where her hand had risen to rest. And the orangery door banged open without knocking, and a small white-faced house elf in a clean tea towel stood trembling on the threshold with a sealed envelope clutched in both hands. And a second owl, black-feathered, enormous, unfamiliar, was already beating its wings against the orangery glass to be let in. The envelope in the house elf's hands was sealed in black wax, not the dark green of the Malfoy crest, not the deep red of the ministry, black, plain, unstamped, the sort of seal that meant the sender did not wish to be identified to anyone but the recipient, and trusted the recipient to recognize the hand. Draco took the envelope from the trembling elf with 2 fingers, the way one might lift a thing that has been left in the rain too long. He looked at the front. He looked at the back. He set it on the breakfast table beside the folded prophet. "Thank you, Pippi. Go and find Mrs. Goss in the kitchens and ask her for a piece of the seed cake. Tell her I said you might have it." The elf, who had clearly been braced for some quite different reception, bowed 3 times in quick succession and fled. The black owl at the window had given up trying to come in. It had deposited a second envelope on the outer sill, taken offence at the closed casement, and was now flying away across the wet park in an indignant arc. Hermione walked very calmly to the window and unlatched it. She brought in the second envelope. It was a near twin of the first. Black wax. No crest. The address, in spidered ink, Miss Hermione J. Granger, Malfoy Manor, by hand. She broke the seal. She read it standing at the window. Then she walked back to the table without a word, sat down, refolded the parchment along its original creases, set it beside her plate, and put her hands flat on either side of it, as though to keep it from rising. "Draco." "Yes. I have received an anonymous letter informing me that if I do not break the engagement before the second Saturday in December, measures will be taken against persons close to me. The persons are named. There are 4 of them. The list is comprehensive." The silence in the orangery rearranged itself. It was not the silence of a moment ago, when his mouth had been on hers above the folded newspaper. It was a different silence, taut, ribbed, almost crystalline, and Hermione could feel her own heartbeat in the small bones of her wrists. Draco did not speak immediately. He picked up his own black-sealed envelope. He broke it. He read, "My name's 6. The minister is on it. So is my mother." "Charming," Indeed. He set the letter down. His hand on the table was perfectly steady. The white scar across his knuckles, the one she knew the history of and would never ask him about again, caught the morning light. "I will write to Robards," he said. "Aurors at every gate by noon. Yes. And to my mother. Today. Within the hour. Yes. And to Potter." She looked up. "To Harry? He runs the Aura division now. He runs half the Aura division now. He runs the half that handles death threats against members of his family." Draco's eyes were on hers. "Which, however inconvenient I find it to admit aloud, is what you are. To him. Which means that as of approximately 9 minutes from now, when the second post leaves the manor, it is also what I am. To him. Whether either of us cares for the genealogy of the sentiment." Hermione opened her mouth. She closed it. She had, she realized, been preparing for fully a year and a half to have to introduce Draco Malfoy to Harry Potter as her future husband. She had rehearsed it in her head perhaps 100 times, over the kitchen sink at Grimmauld Place, on the long flue journeys to and from the ministry, lying awake at 3 in the morning in this very house. She had imagined 100 opening lines. She had imagined 100 terrible silences. She had not, in any of her rehearsals, imagined that the introduction would be affected by an anonymous death threat delivered by an offended owl. She laughed. She did not mean to laugh. It came out of her in a single, small, startled sound, half breath, half disbelief, and once it was out, she found she could not put it back. And a second laugh came after it, and a third, and she pressed both hands over her face and laughed into them with her shoulders shaking until Draco was around the table again and had her by the wrists and was easing her hands gently down from her face. "Hermione, I'm all right. You are not all right. I am perfectly all right. I am perfectly furious. Draco, I have been threatened by better correspondence than this. I have been threatened in Latin. Some idiot in a hood thinks he is going to frighten me out of marrying you with... She gestured at the parchment. With a list and a piece of black wax he probably bought from the cheap stationers in Nocturne Alley. And I am to... She broke off. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed until Draco's fingers closed around her wrists that her hands had been shaking the entire time. He saw her see it. He did not comment. He drew her up out of her chair and he steered her gently, the way one steers a person who has had a fall but does not yet realize it, away from the breakfast table and into the smaller sitting room beyond the orangery, where the fire had been lit since 6, and the curtains were still half drawn against the rain. He sat her down on the small sofa. He poured her something from a decanter, she did not see what, and pressed the glass into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Drink. Draco, it is 8:20 in the morning. Drink, a swallow, that is all." She drank a swallow. It was fire whiskey and very old, and it burned in a slow, good line all the way down her throat to her sternum, and she felt her hands stop shaking before the glass had left her mouth. He took the glass back. He set it on the side table. He sat down beside her, not touching, his forearms resting on his knees, and looked at the fire. "They have been waiting," he said quietly, "for someone to give them a reason. I know. It was never going to be the engagement that did it. The engagement is only the pretext. There are men in this country, Men whose names I grew up calling at my own dinner table, who have been waiting for nearly 4 years for a public moment large enough to use as cover. We have handed them one. That is all this is. I know. We can still... Don't. I was not going to say it. You were. I was going to say it, and then I was going to take it back before you had finished hearing me say it. Let me have the credit for the second half, Hermione. She turned her face towards him. He was still looking at the fire. The flames moved across the side of his face in slow, soft gold, and she could see, in the line of his profile, the small twitch of muscle at his jaw that she had been watching for 2 years now, and she thought, with a clarity that arrived in her like the fire whiskey, hot and certain and travelling from sternum outwards, I am not going to let them have him. She had thought it before. She had thought it in different shapes, at different hours, in different rooms. She thought it now in a shape she had not previously had a use for. I am not going to let them have him. I am not going to let them have 1 minute of this. I am not going to let them have the wedding. I am not going to let them have the engagement. I am not going to let them have the next 40 years. They have already had quite enough of him. They have already had his childhood and his adolescence and the better part of his 20s, and they are not, while there is breath in my body, going to have his December. She set her hand on his forearm. He turned then. He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were very dark. Write to Harry, she said. I will write to Ron. We will have them here by supper time. Hermione. Both of them. Tonight. At this table. With your mother. Yes, Draco, with your mother. I do not propose to put this house under siege without putting it under siege properly, and that requires that everybody who proposes to defend it should at least have been introduced to each other before the actual besieging begins. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth turned up. It was not a smile. It was the suggestion of a smile, the way the suggestion at the corner of his mother's mouth had been the suggestion of a smile 3 days ago in the drawing room, except that on Draco's face, on this morning, in this firelight, the suggestion went a great deal further than the suggestion of any of his mother's smiles had ever gone in his life. It travelled. It reached his eyes. It moved something in his throat. And when he reached for her hand, the left, the one with the moonstone, he did so with the small, unhurried care of a man picking up a thing he intended to keep on picking up every morning for the rest of his life. You are, he said, an extraordinary woman. I know. Insufferable. I know. I am going to spend the rest of my life, he said, being told what to do by you in front of my own fireplaces, and I cannot remember now what I expected to be doing with my evenings instead. Reading, probably. Brooding. Drinking too much. Yes, almost certainly. It is a great improvement. It is an enormous improvement, Hermione. He bent his head. He kissed the inside of her wrist where the pulse jumped. He held his mouth there for a moment, and she felt the faint, warm scrape of breath against her skin, and she closed her eyes and let her head tip back against the sofa cushion, and felt, for the first time since the Morning Post, that the day was going to be survivable. The fire shifted. A log settled with a small, dry crack. Outside, the rain began again, harder now, in slow grey waves against the long windows. "Write the letters," she said, without opening her eyes. "In a moment." "Now, Draco." "In a moment, Hermione." She felt his weight beside her on the sofa. She felt his shoulder come gently against hers. She felt his head, after another moment, come to rest against the side of her own. She did not move. She let him stay there. She let herself stay there. They sat together in the warm room with the fire burning and the rain on the glass. And for perhaps 3 full minutes, neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved. And the orangery door at the far end of the corridor opened and closed twice as the elves came and went on their morning errands. And somewhere far above, in the south wing, a clock began softly to strike the half-hour. Draco rose. He walked to the small writing desk in the alcove. He sat down. He drew a sheet of parchment from the drawer, dipped his quill, and began, in his slanted, decisive hand, to write to Harry Potter. He had reached the 3rd line when the bell at the south gate began, deep and slow and very loud, to ring. The south gate bell was old. It hung in a stone arch at the head of the long drive, and it had not been rung in earnest, Draco's grandfather had once told him, since the Second Boer War. It rang now in slow, tolling notes that travelled the wet park and rolled up the gravel and struck the south face of the manor with a sound that seemed to come less through the air than through the stone. Draco was on his feet before the 3rd stroke. "Stay here. Draco. Stay in this room. Wand out. I mean it, Hermione." She was already on her feet. Her wand was already in her hand. She had drawn it without thinking, the way she drew breath, and she fell in behind him at the doorway before he had finished turning, and he did not waste the breath it would have cost to argue with her again. They went down the corridor together. They went down the great staircase together. The bell tolled a 4th time, a 5th, and stopped. In the entrance hall, a single house elf was hovering near the door, with both hands pressed against the front of her tea towel. "Master Draco, sir. There is being 3 persons at the south gate, sir, and they is saying, names Tippy. Mr. Potter, sir. Mr. Weasley, sir, and Mrs. Tonks, sir." Draco stopped walking. It was so small a thing. A single house elf giving a list of 3 names in a clean tea towel, and the world had reorganized itself around him in the space between 2 heartbeats. "Mrs. Tonks," he repeated. "Yes, sir. She is saying her name is being Andromeda Tonks, sir, and she is saying she is coming because her sister has written to her, sir, and she is saying—" "Open the gate," Hermione said quietly. "Tippy, open it. Let them through." The elf vanished with a small, clean crack. Draco did not move. Hermione had stopped a half-pace behind him. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She only waited the way one waits beside a person who has had unexpected news on a station platform. And after perhaps 4 seconds, Draco drew in a breath that did not entirely steady him, and turned his face very slightly towards her without looking at her. "My mother wrote to her." "It seems so." "My mother wrote to her aunt without telling either of us." "Yes." "Hermione." "I know, Draco." He closed his eyes for 1 beat. He opened them. "Right," he said. They were in the south drive when the carriage came up the gravel. It was not a carriage Draco recognized. A small, dark brougham, hired-looking, the horses unbothered by the rain. It pulled up at the bottom of the steps, and the door opened, and Harry Potter stepped out first. Draco had not seen Harry Potter at close quarters in 11 months. He had seen him across ministry corridors. He had seen him once on the far side of a very crowded restaurant in Soho. He had not stood within 10 feet of him since the autumn after the trials, and at that meeting they had not, in any meaningful sense, spoken. Potter stepped down, turned, offered his hand back into the carriage. Andromeda Tonks took it. She came down the carriage step the way Narcissa came down a staircase, without hurry, without any indication that her movement might be observed. And when her feet touched the wet gravel, she straightened and turned and looked directly at Draco. She had her sister's face. It was the first thing he had not, somehow, prepared for. Older than his mother by several years, the hair greying in soft, uneven streaks, the mouth set differently. But the bones were Narcissa's bones, and the eyes were Narcissa's eyes, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not warmth and was not coldness, but was the steady measuring look of a woman who was not yet prepared to commit to either. "Mr. Malfoy, Mrs. Tonks, your mother's letter reached me on Wednesday evening. I came as soon as I could arrange it. Thank you. I did not know she had written. No." A very small, very dry pause. "I rather thought you did not." Ron Weasley unfolded himself out of the carriage last. He was taller than Draco remembered. He was looking, Draco noted with a kind of distant clinical interest, exactly as one would expect a man to look who had come to a death threat at his best friend's fiancée's house at 9:30 on a Friday morning in the rain. "Granger. Ron. You all right?" "Yes." "Malfoy. Weasley." It was the entire greeting. Neither of them offered a hand. Neither of them needed to. Hermione let out a small breath beside Draco that he could feel rather than hear, and he understood, with a flicker of something like wry gratitude, that for the moment the absence of warmth was the warmth, that anything more would have been performance, and Ron Weasley did not perform, and neither, in this particular drive, in this particular rain, did he. "Come in," Draco said. "Please, all of you." They went in. Narcissa was waiting in the small green drawing room. She was standing by the fire. She had not sat down. She was wearing a high-collared morning gown of dark grey wool. Hermione recognized it, distantly, as a near cousin of the dove grey she had been sent for Thursday's tea, and her hands were folded one over the other at her waist, and she did not, when the door opened, move. Andromeda stopped 2 paces inside the doorway. For perhaps half a minute, the 2 sisters looked at each other across the carpet of the small green drawing room and did not speak. Hermione became aware of her own breathing. She became aware of Draco's hand near hers, not touching, near enough that she could feel the heat of it through her sleeve. She became aware of Harry. Harry, who had positioned himself, she now realized, with his back precisely to the door, the way a person positions themselves when they have come into a room they intend to defend. And of Ron, who had moved to the long sash window and was standing with his shoulder against the frame in a posture of apparent ease that Hermione knew from a great many wars was nothing of the sort. Then Narcissa moved. She walked slowly across the green carpet. She stopped a yard from her sister. She did not raise her hand. She did not bend. She did not speak, at first, at all. When she did speak, her voice was perfectly level. "Andromeda. Sissy. Thank you for coming. I do not yet know, said Andromeda, what I have come for. No, I imagine you do not. Please sit down, all of you. Draco, ring for tea. Tippy will bring sandwiches. Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, you will of course require something more substantial. You have been up since before dawn. Miss Granger. She turned. Her silver eyes settled on Hermione. Will you sit by me? It was not a question. Hermione sat. She sat on the green silk sofa beside Narcissa Malfoy, with her wand returned to her sleeve, and her hands folded in her lap, and the moonstone catching the fire and the rain, a low grey hush against the long windows. And she watched Andromeda Tonks take the wing chair opposite, and she watched Draco take the smaller chair beside her sister, and she watched Harry settle himself by the door with his arms folded and his eyes moving carefully between every face in the room. And she watched Ron remain at the window, and she watched the elves bring tea and small triangles of brown bread with cucumber and small bowls of soup that nobody touched. And she listened for the next 2¼ hours to the most quietly extraordinary conversation she had ever sat through in her life. It began, as such conversations had to begin, with the letters. Narcissa, without any ceremony, produced both black-sealed envelopes from a small writing folder beside her and laid them on the low table. She produced, beside them, a third, addressed to her in the same spidery hand, received yesterday evening. She produced, beside that, a fourth. 4, said Harry quietly. All in the same hand. All 4. Same wax, same parchment, same nib. Yes, and the same stationer, I believe, though that is for your office to confirm. It is. May I? He came forward. He gathered the 4 envelopes. He examined them in silence for perhaps 2 minutes, turning each one, holding each one to the firelight, sniffing once, very faintly, at the wax of the third. He set them down again. I know the hand, he said. The room shifted. You know it. I have seen it before, twice, both times in the last 6 months, both times on parchment delivered to ministry persons in positions of seniority, both times anonymous, both times traced to... He hesitated, and then evidently decided that the present company was the present company. To a small group of former associates of your late husband, Mrs. Malfoy. Not, you will be relieved to hear, persons of any great competence. They have been making themselves a nuisance throughout the autumn. They have not, until this week, escalated to direct threats against named persons. Which means, he looked at Draco, that something about this engagement has frightened them in a way that nothing else has, for nearly 4 years. Why? Said Hermione. It was the first word she had spoken since sitting down. Harry looked at her. Because, he said slowly, you are going to be a Malfoy. And once you are a Malfoy, the Daily Prophet cannot print the word they printed this morning above your photograph any longer without printing it above the name of the oldest pure-blood house in England. And once that happens, Hermione, the entire scaffolding they have been hiding behind, the entire pretense that there is still a respectable, well-bred wizarding establishment that quietly agrees with them, collapses. Your engagement is the end of their cover. That is why. There was a small silence. Then Andromeda Tonks, who had not yet spoken, set down her teacup. My niece, she said, was killed at the Battle of Hogwarts by one of those people, or by a person very much like one of those people. I have not, in 7 years, set foot in this house. I have not, in 37 years, spoken to my sister. I came today because she wrote to me, and her letter said, among other things, that the woman her son intends to marry had asked, on Thursday afternoon, that my name be spoken aloud at the betrothal. She looked at Hermione. Is that true, Miss Granger? Yes. Why? Hermione opened her mouth. She closed it. She found she did not know in any compact way how to answer. She thought of saying, because it was right. She thought of saying, because I read the genealogy. She thought of saying, because I could not bear the idea of standing in his ancestral hall while a portrait recited the names of dead men who had hated everyone like you and everyone like me, without at least one living person being named whose love had cost her this whole house. She said, in the end, the simplest of the things she might have said, because he is the man I love, and the recitation should be true. Andromeda's eyes did not move from her face. After perhaps 4 seconds, the older woman's mouth altered, very slightly, very briefly, and Hermione realized, with a small startled flare somewhere under her ribs, that she had seen this near smile before. 2 days ago, in a different drawing room, on a different face, across a different tea. Sissy, said Andromeda quietly without turning, I shall require a great deal more tea. Yes, said Narcissa. And then we are going, said Andromeda, to write a guest list. Hermione felt Draco's hand find hers. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She tightened her fingers around his and did not let go. And across the small green drawing room, Harry Potter, who had not, in 11 months, met Draco Malfoy's eye for more than half a second at a stretch, looked at him now, levelly, and inclined his head perhaps 1/4 of an inch, in the manner of one professional acknowledging another. And Ron, at the window, turned at last from the rain and crossed the room and sat down on the sofa beside Hermione and accepted a sandwich from the tray without remark. The rain was harder now. It struck the long windows in slow grey waves, and somewhere far above the house a clock began to chime the hour, and the 7 of them sat in the small green drawing room and began, very quietly, to plan a war. It was past 3 in the morning when Hermione found him in the conservatory. She had not been able to sleep. She had tried for almost 2 hours, lying on her side in the great curtained bed, with the moonstone turned inward against her palm, so that she could feel its small, cool weight against her own skin. And she had counted the slow breaths of the man who was supposed to be lying beside her, and she had realized at last that there were no breaths beside her to count. She rose. She drew on her dressing gown. She did not light a candle. She knew the house well enough now, after 18 months, to walk it in the dark. The conservatory was at the far end of the east wing. It was a long glass room running south, full of orchids and lemon trees, and a single enormous fig that had been there, the gardeners said, since the reign of George II. The night was clear at last. The rain had stopped a little before midnight, and the moon, almost full, hung low and pale through the glass roof, and the orchids stood in their silver pots like a small, still congregation of pale faces turned all in one direction. Draco was sitting on the low stone bench beside the fig. He was in shirt sleeves. He had not put on a coat. He had a glass in one hand, half full of something pale gold, untasted, and the other hand was resting on his knee, the long fingers loose and open. He did not look up when she came in. He had heard her. She could tell. He had heard her several rooms ago. He simply did not look up. She crossed the slate floor in her bare feet. The stone was very cold. She did not mind. She sat down beside him on the bench, careful not to jostle the glass, and she folded her hands in her lap and waited. For a long time he did not speak. The moonlight came down through the glass and made silver of the rim of the glass in his hand, and of the small hairs at the open collar of his shirt, and of the very pale crown of his hair where it fell forward over his eyes. He did not move to put the hair back. He did not move to lift the glass to his mouth. He simply sat, looking at nothing in particular in the middle distance, and breathed. And after some minutes, she became aware that his shoulder was perhaps half an inch from hers and was not yet touching. She bridged the half-inch. She leaned very gently sideways against him. He let out a long, shaking breath. "Hermione." "Yes, I cannot sleep. I know." He was quiet for another long moment. Then, without looking at her, "I do not know what kind of man I will be tomorrow." She turned her face very slightly into his shoulder. "Go on." "I do not know what kind of man I will be when 200 people are looking at me, and the woman I am about to bind myself to in front of 7 centuries of my own ancestors is standing beside me in cream silk, and the recitation is going forward, and my mother's voice is doing the thing it does when she is very near the edge of what she can manage. I do not know what kind of man I will be. I am perfectly composed in advance of every catastrophe I have ever walked into, and entirely unmade in advance of this one. I have been sitting here for 2 hours, Hermione, and I have tried to picture standing at the top of the East Ballroom in my grandfather's coat, and I cannot picture it. I can picture the room. I can picture the candles. I can picture you. I cannot picture me." She did not answer at once. She lifted her hand. She found his free hand on his knee. She slid her fingers through his and brought their joined hands up into her lap and let them rest there against the silk of her dressing gown. The moonstone turned in towards his palm now, pressing small and cool and steady against the center of him. "Draco." "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me in the orangery on Tuesday morning?" "I have said a great deal of foolish things in the orangery this week." "You said you were tired of pretending not to be frightened." "Yes." "You said you had always been frightened with me. You said you were simply tired of pretending otherwise." "Yes." "Be tired of it tomorrow." He turned his face then, slowly. He looked down at her. The moon was behind her, she knew, and her own face was probably half in shadow, and she could not read his expression in any precise way. Only the shine of his eyes, very bright in the dim, and the slight, uneven motion of his throat as he swallowed. "Hermione." "Be tired of pretending. Tomorrow. Stand at the top of the East Ballroom in your grandfather's coat, and be exactly the man you have been in this conservatory for the last 2 hours. Tired. Frightened. Mine. That is the man I am marrying, Draco. That is the man I am binding myself to in front of 7 centuries of your ancestors. I am not marrying the composed man. I have never been marrying the composed man. The composed man is a costume you put on at 14 because your father told you to, and you have been trying for 12 years to take it off, and I am asking you. I am asking you, my love, to take it off, all the way off, in front of 200 people, and stand there in the rest of yourself, because the rest of you is what I came here for." He did not speak. He set the glass down on the slate beside the bench, very carefully, without taking his eyes off her. He brought his free hand up. He cupped the side of her face, the way a man cups water he means not to spill. His thumb moved once across her cheekbone, and she felt the small, faint scrape of where he had not shaved since morning. And she felt the cold weight of the silver signet ring he wore on his little finger against the soft place behind her ear. "I have spent so much of my life," he said, very low, "being told what kind of man I was supposed to be, and then so much of the rest of it being told what kind of man I had failed to be. And it has, Hermione, it has only been in the rooms where you are that I have ever been able to set both of those down at once and find out what I am actually like in between. I do not know how to thank you for it. I do not know how to thank anyone for a thing like that. You are not supposed to thank me, Draco. You are supposed to marry me." A small, wet laugh got out of him. He bent his forehead against hers. They sat like that for a long time. His hand was still against her face. Hers was still in his lap. Above them, the moon moved slowly across the glass of the conservatory roof, and the silver of it travelled across the slate floor, and the orchids in their pale pots stood still and watched in their congregation of small bowed heads, and a single owl, perhaps the same owl that had answered the other owl on the night of the proposal, perhaps not, cried once, far out across the park, and was not answered this time. After a while, he said against her temple, "What time is it?" "A little after 3. 12 hours. Yes. My mother will be up by 6. I know. She will come and find me before the rest of the house wakes. She does it on every difficult morning. She has done it since I was very small. She will not say anything important. She will rearrange the cufflinks I have already laid out and tell me about the weather and ask me whether I would like coffee in the dressing room, which I will not want, and then she will go away again. Yes, she loves me, Hermione. I know, Draco. I did not know for a long time that she did. I thought she did. I assumed she did. But I did not know it. I know it now. I know it because of how she sat in that drawing room on Thursday afternoon with her own sister for the first time in 37 years and let you sit beside her on her sofa and ask for a guest list. She did that for me. She did it badly. She did it in the only way she has ever known how to do anything, which is to organize an event and serve very good tea. But she did it for me. I know. And I do not want to disappoint her tomorrow. You will not. How do you know? Because tomorrow you are going to stand at the top of the East Ballroom in your grandfather's coat, with me on your arm, and you are going to do the only thing she has ever, in her entire life, properly wanted you to do, which is to be visibly, unmistakably, publicly happy. That is the only thing left, Draco. We have done the rest. The list is done. The threats are being handled. The renunciation is signed. The recitation has been rewritten. The lace is here. The cream silk is here. Andromeda is here. Harry is here. Ron, somewhat to his own astonishment, is here. There is nothing left for you to do tomorrow except be happy. And I am going to stand beside you and make it as easy for you as I possibly can. He drew in a breath. He let it out. He turned his face into her hair and held it there, and she felt the small, uneven warmth of him against her temple, and she understood that he was crying, silently, the way she sometimes cried, without sound, without movement, only the slow giving way of something held too long. She did not remark on it. She lifted her free hand and slid it up the back of his neck, into the soft, pale hair at his nape, and held him there against her, and waited. After a long time, she felt him steady. He drew back. He did not look away from her. His eyes were wet. He did not apologize for them. He did not pretend they were anything other than what they were. He lifted her left hand, and he turned it over, and he looked down at the moonstone on her finger as though he were seeing it for the first time, and his thumb moved once across her knuckle. "You wear it well." "Yes. I have been wanting to tell you that for almost 2 weeks. I have noticed it on my own hand approximately 90 times a day." "Have you?" "Yes." "What do you think about when you notice it?" She considered. The conservatory was so quiet. She could hear the small ticking sound of the cooling earth in the orchid pots. She could hear the faint draught moving in the high glass of the roof. She could hear his breathing, slow now, settled at last, half an inch from her own. "I think," she said, "that I am not the same woman I was 18 months ago. I think I am not even the same woman I was 3 weeks ago. I think I have become a person who walks through her own life feeling for a small cold weight on her hand the way another person might feel in her pocket for a key. I think I have not, in any previous arrangement of my life, had a key like this one. I think I have been waiting for it without knowing that the wait was the shape of my days. And I think, Draco, I think I am going to wear it tomorrow as though I have been wearing it for years, because in some way I have not, until this minute, had the vocabulary for I have." He bent. He kissed her, slow, unhurried, almost grave. Not the kiss above the breakfast paper, not the kiss on the library rug. A different kiss, a quieter kiss, a kiss like a vow signed in advance of the witnesses. His hand still cupped along the side of her face, hers still in the hair at his nape. The moonstone held warm between their joined fingers in her lap, and the moon moving very slowly across the glass roof above them. He drew back at last. He pressed his forehead against hers again. His eyes were closed. "Come back to bed. In a moment. Hermione, in a moment, my love. Sit with me. A little longer." He sat. They stayed in the conservatory until the first thin grey of pre-dawn began to soften the eastern panes of the glass, and the orchids stood in their silver pots like small patient witnesses. And somewhere in the south wing, a clock began, very softly, to strike 5. The East Ballroom had been built in the reign of Charles II. It was a long room, longer than it was wide, with a vaulted ceiling painted in pale blue and gold, and a floor of inlaid oak that had been waxed in the small hours of the morning until it caught the candlelight like still water. 1,000 candles had been lit. They stood in branched silver candelabra along the walls and in the great chandeliers above, and in tall standing sconces at the head of the room, where, on a low dais covered in cream silk, the recitation would shortly begin. The scent of beeswax and white roses and very faint orange flower water moved in slow currents through the room. 240 people stood in the ballroom and waited. Hermione stood in the antechamber. She had been laced into the cream silk an hour ago. The Belgian lace had been settled over her shoulders by a woman who had not spoken a single word the entire time, and whose hands had moved with the patient certainty of a person handling a thing too old to be insured. Her hair had been drawn up in a soft, loose knot at the nape of her neck. A single white rose had been pinned, almost as an afterthought, behind her left ear. The moonstone was on her finger. She was not, she realized with a small flicker of distant amusement, frightened. She had been frightened that morning. She had been frightened at the first fitting, and at the second, and at the seventh. She had been frightened at the breakfast table with the Daily Prophet folded between them, and at the south gate when the bell had rung, and in the small green drawing room when Andromeda Tonks had set down her teacup and asked, without inflection, "Is that true, Miss Granger?" She had been frightened in different ways on every one of the 40 days between the proposal and the second Saturday in December. She was not frightened now. The door opened. Narcissa stepped into the antechamber. She closed the door softly behind her. She was dressed in deep silver grey. She had a small white camellia at her throat. She walked across the antechamber and stopped a yard from Hermione and looked at her for perhaps 4 seconds in silence. "Miss Granger, Mrs. Malfoy, I should like to ask you to call me by my given name from this evening forward." Hermione drew in a small, careful breath. "Yes, yes, Narcissa. Yes, Narcissa." The older woman did not smile, but her hand came up and she touched, very briefly, with 2 fingers, the edge of the antique lace where it lay along Hermione's collarbone. The gesture was as economical as everything else she did. It lasted perhaps a second. Then her hand returned to her own side, and she stood quite still, and her silver eyes did not move from Hermione's face. "My son," she said quietly, "is waiting for you. I know. I have known him for 26 years. I have not seen him as he was this morning. I do not think any room in this house has ever seen him as he was this morning. I am not asking you to answer. I am telling you. Because in one moment I am going to open this door and you are going to walk the length of the East Ballroom on Mr. Potter's arm. Yes, Mr. Potter's. I have been informed of the arrangement and have, on consideration, found it tolerable. And you are going to step up onto the dais, and you are going to take my son's hand, and you are going to stand beside him through the recitation, and I should like you to know, before you do any of that you have my blessing. It is not a thing I have given before. It is not a thing I expected to give. I give it now without reservation. Do you understand me, Hermione?" "Yes." "Good." Narcissa turned. She opened the antechamber door. The East Ballroom unfolded before them in candlelight. Hermione walked. She walked on Harry's arm, Harry in his best dark robes, his hair, for once, almost tidy, his arm held perfectly still under her hand. And she walked slowly, the way she had been told to walk, neither hurrying nor lingering. And the 240 faces turned towards her in the candlelight, blurred into a single warm shape at the edges of her vision. She did not look at the faces. She looked at Draco. He was standing at the top of the room. He was in his grandfather's coat, dark green, almost black in the candlelight, the high collar fastened with a single small silver clasp at the throat. His hair was combed back. His hands were loose at his sides. He was not, she saw, hiding behind any of his prepared faces. He was not composed. He was not arranged. He was looking at her down the long length of the ballroom with the whole of himself in his eyes. And as she came nearer, she saw the slight, uneven motion of his breathing under the green coat. And she saw the wet shine at the inner corners of his eyes that he had not bothered to disguise. And she thought, with a clear, steady warmth that travelled outwards from her sternum to her fingertips, yes, that man, that is the one. She reached the foot of the dais. Harry stopped. He turned to her. He pressed her hand once where it lay on his sleeve. He inclined his head perhaps a quarter of an inch, the same precise quarter-inch she registered with a small private flare of warmth that he had inclined towards Draco in the small green drawing-room 6 weeks before. And he stepped back. Draco came down the dais step. He took her hand. The recitation began. It began with Armand Malfoy in the year 1066, and it travelled forward, name by name, generation by generation, in the slow, careful voice of Great Aunt Walburga's portrait, which had condescended to attend by means of a temporary frame mounted at the side of the dais. The names came one after another in the candlelight. Hermione stood in silence. She had been told to stand in silence. She did so. She felt the warm, steady weight of Draco's hand in hers, and the small, cool weight of the moonstone between their joined palms, and the slow rise and fall of his breathing, half an inch from her shoulder. And she listened. The recitation reached the 20th century. It named Abraxas. It named Lucius. It named Draco. It paused. And then, in a voice that did not falter, that did not hesitate, that did not, by any audible inflection, mark the moment as anything other than the continuation of 7 centuries of unbroken record, the portrait of Great Aunt Walburga said, "And in the line of black, by the marriage of Druella Rosier to Cygnus Black III, 3 daughters, Bellatrix, who is dead, Narcissa, who is here, and Andromeda, who is also here, and whose husband, Edward Tonks, gave his life in the late war, and whose daughter, Nymphadora, also gave hers." There was a small audible intake of breath somewhere on the left side of the ballroom. Hermione did not turn her head. She felt Draco's hand close around hers very tightly. She felt his thumb move once, slowly, across her knuckle. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward. The portrait went on. The recitation finished. The candles did not gutter. The room held. It was done. Andromeda Tonks, standing on the second tier of the dais in dark plum silk with her grey hair drawn back from her face, did not move. But her right hand, which had been resting on the silver railing, closed once around it, very tightly, and then released. Across the dais, Narcissa Malfoy stood with her chin lifted and her silver eyes very bright, and did not look at her sister, and did not need to. Draco turned to Hermione. He did not say what he was supposed to say next. He did not say any of the prepared phrases. He looked down at her in the candlelight with his face entirely unguarded, and he lifted her hand, the left, the one with the moonstone, and he pressed his mouth to the back of it, slowly, in front of 240 witnesses, and he held it there for a long moment. When he raised his head, he said, perfectly clearly, so that the whole ballroom could hear, "I love you." I have loved you for longer than I have known. I will love you tomorrow, and on the morning after, and on every morning I am given, and I would like, in the presence of these people, to begin." He kissed her. The East Ballroom, which had not seen a kiss of any seriousness since the second wedding of Brutus Malfoy in 1873, watched in absolute silence as the heir of the house bent over the cream silk and the antique Belgian lace and kissed his bride-to-be, slowly, unhurriedly, both his hands cupped along the sides of her face, and as she rose onto her toes and curled her fingers into the lapel of his grandfather's coat and kissed him back. Somewhere on the left side of the ballroom, Ron Weasley said audibly, "Oh, for—" Somewhere on the right, Andromeda Tonks made a sound that was almost a laugh. The candles burned on. They were married in May. It was a small wedding. They had agreed on that, eventually, between themselves and Narcissa and Andromeda and Molly Weasley, who had appointed herself, by means nobody quite understood, to the catering. It was held in the rose garden at the manor in the late afternoon, under a high blue sky scrubbed clean by a morning of wind. Hermione wore pale rose silk. Draco wore grey. The moonstone stayed on her right hand now. A plain gold band sat on her left. They moved, after the wedding, into a small stone cottage at the far end of the Malfoy estate. It had been a gamekeeper's house once. It had 3 rooms and a slate roof, and a fireplace large enough to roast a goose in, and an old climbing rose that came up over the south porch in June. Draco kept his rooms at the manor for when his mother needed him, and Hermione kept her office at the ministry for when the country needed her. But they slept every night in the cottage. They woke every morning in the cottage. They drank their first tea of the day at a scrubbed pine table by the south window, where the light came in at an angle and made gold of the steam rising from the cups. The first child was a daughter. She was born in the 2nd February after the wedding, in the small upstairs bedroom of the cottage, in a thin, cold dawn, and she had her father's pale hair and her mother's stubborn mouth, and they named her Lyra Andromeda Malfoy. And the great-aunt for whom her second name had been given came up the long path from the manor in the snow with her arms full of white camellias and held the baby in her lap by the cottage fire for an entire afternoon without speaking once. The second child was a son. He was born in the autumn 3 years later, in the same upstairs bedroom, in a warm, wet October dusk, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's grey eyes, and they named him Hyperion Edward, and Andromeda, when she came, did weep that time quietly into the small blanket on his head. Narcissa lived another 21 years. She lived to see her granddaughter sorted into Ravenclaw and her grandson sorted, to nobody's surprise except her own, into Hufflepuff. She lived to see the rose garden at the manor opened once a year on a Saturday in June to the children of the village, who came in their best clothes and ran shrieking through the gravel paths with cake in both hands. She lived to see her sister, in the last year of her own life, move into a small set of rooms in the south wing of the manor, where the two of them sat together by the fire in the small green drawing room for 340 afternoons, and drank tea and quarrelled gently about everything, and forgave each other without ever saying so, for everything else. Draco kept the moonstone. When Hermione died at 89, in the small upstairs bedroom of the cottage, in a thin, cold dawn very much like the one in which Lyra had been born, she pressed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He knew. He had always known. He wore it on his little finger for the 11 months remaining to him after that, and when at last he too lay down for the last time, in the same room, in the same bed, his hand was closed around it still, and his face, so his daughter would say afterwards, and his son, and his grandchildren, and all the small great-grandchildren who came after, was the face of a man who had been, beyond any reasonable hope, beyond any of the things he had been told in his early life he deserved, beyond every threatening owl and every black-sealed envelope and every front page of every newspaper, completely and without reservation loved. The moonstone went, in the end, to Lyra. She wore it on her right hand all her life, and she passed it, when the time came, to her own daughter, and that daughter passed it to hers, and somewhere, on a hand in some quiet room, in some quiet century, in a house that has not yet been built, it is being worn at this exact moment, small and cool and steady, catching the light from a window. It was the morning of their 50th anniversary. The sun came up slowly over the south meadow that day, the way it had been coming up over that particular meadow for some 400 years. Pale gold at first, then warmer, then the proper, deep, honey-coloured light of an English June, moving slowly through the climbing rows at the cottage window, and across the scrubbed pine table, and along the worn red tiles of the kitchen floor. Hermione was already awake. She had been awake, in fact, since a little before 5. This was not unusual. She had been waking before 5 for the better part of 40 years now, and she had given up apologizing for it some decades ago. She had risen quietly, drawn on her dressing gown, the same dove-grey wool one she had been given as a wedding present by Narcissa 50 Mays ago, mended 4 times since, the cuffs softer than any cuff had a right to be, and gone down into the kitchen in her bare feet. The kettle was singing on the hob. She stood at the south window and watched the light come up. The rose was in full bloom. It had reached the eaves the summer after they had moved in, and it had stayed there ever since. And every June it produced an indecent quantity of small pale pink flowers that she had long since stopped pretending she had any intention of pruning. A blackbird was sitting in it now, eating green fly off the new leaves, unconcerned with her observing him through the glass. She heard the soft shuffle of slippers on the staircase. "You are early," she said, without turning. "You are earlier. I am always earlier. Yes." A pause. The kettle came off the hob behind her. "Tea? Please." She turned then. Draco was at the kitchen counter in his old grey dressing gown, his hair entirely white now and softer than it had been when she had first known him, his shoulders narrower, his hands a little slower. He was making tea the way he had been making it for 50 years. Too much loose leaf in the pot, the cream poured first into her cup and never into his, the small chipped sugar bowl set out, though neither of them had taken sugar in either of their teas since approximately 1999. The ritual mattered. The ritual had always mattered. The tea, in some sense, was almost beside the point. He brought the cups to the pine table. He set hers down in front of her. He sat down opposite. He looked at her for a moment in the soft early light and did not say anything. She took a swallow of her tea. It was, as it had been for 50 years, slightly too strong. "What are you thinking about?" she said. You at 8 in the morning on the second Saturday of December, in the antechamber off the East Ballroom, with the lace. Goodness. My mother had just gone out. You were standing by the window. Your hand was on the moonstone. You were not, I remember now thinking, frightened anymore, and you had been frightened in different shapes for the entire 40 days before. And I was standing at the top of the ballroom waiting for the door to open, and I thought, she has stopped being frightened. She has chosen to stop. She has chosen this. And I did not know, until that moment, how badly I had needed to be chosen on purpose. She set her tea down. She reached across the table. He gave her his hand without her having to ask. It was thinner now than it had been at 26. The knuckles were a little larger. The white scar across the back of it was almost invisible against the paler skin. The signet ring he had worn on his little finger for 50 years was still there. The moonstone, which he had pressed into his hand on a different morning that was still, mercifully, a great many years in their future, was not yet on it. It was on her own right hand, where it had been since the wedding. It caught the early light through the south window and threw a thin, pale shimmer onto the pine of the table between them. "I chose," she said. "I have been choosing, every morning, for 50 years. Yes. It has been the easiest thing I have ever done." "Has it?" "After the first 18 months, Draco, it has been the easiest thing I have ever done." He laughed. It was a small, dry laugh, almost soundless, and it travelled out of him into the soft kitchen air and was gone. But she caught the shape of it and kept it. The latch of the garden gate clicked. They both turned. Lyra was coming up the gravel path. She was 46 now, tall, her pale hair cropped short the way she had been wearing it since her 30th birthday. And she had the small wicker basket over her arm that meant she had stopped at the manor kitchens on her way down to collect the cake Narcissa's old recipe book had been bullied into producing for her parents' anniversary. Behind her came her own daughter, Cassiopeia, 17, and home from her 6th year at Hogwarts for the summer, all elbows and dark hair, and her great-grandmother Hermione's exact stubborn mouth. Behind Cassiopeia, walking more slowly, came Hyperion. He was 43. He had his father's grey eyes and his mother's habit of stopping in the middle of a path to look at something nobody else had noticed. And he was carrying, very carefully, the small sleeping form of his own son, 18 months old, named Edward after the great-grandfather he would never meet, fast asleep against his father's shoulder with one fist closed in the collar of his father's shirt. The kitchen door opened. "You are not dressed," said Lyra by way of greeting. "It is 6 o'clock in the morning," said Hermione. "It is 6:30, and Grandmother is already on her way down with Aunt Andromeda, and Uncle Harry and Aunt Ginny have just flewed into the manor, and Uncle Ron and Aunt Pansy will be here by 9. And if you think any of these people are going to find you in your dressing gown, Aunt Pansy will find it hilarious." Aunt Pansy finds everything hilarious. That is not a defense. Cassiopeia, who had crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, had already gone round the table and bent and kissed her grandfather on the temple in the unself-conscious way of a girl who had been doing it since she could walk. Draco lifted his hand and cupped the back of her head for a moment without looking up. "Grandad, Cassie, happy anniversary. Thank you, my love. Gran." She came round. She kissed Hermione also. She smelled, very faintly, of broomstick polish. "Happy anniversary. I made you a thing. It is in the basket. Mum says it is sentimental." "Your mother says everything is sentimental." "I do not," said Lyra from the door, where she was unpacking the basket onto the dresser. "I say some things are sentimental. I say this thing is sentimental. There is a distinction." Hyperion had eased himself onto the bench by the fire and was rearranging the sleeping weight of his son so that the child's head lay more comfortably against his shoulder. He looked up at his parents over the small fair head and smiled, slowly, the slow, tired smile of a man who had been awake since 4 with a teething toddler and was not yet entirely persuaded that morning was a good idea. "Mum, Dad, Hyperion, I brought you flowers, but Edward ate one of them in the flue." "Which one?" "The peony." "Ah, he seems all right. Peonies are mostly fine. That is what I told Astoria." The kitchen had filled. It did this on certain mornings, anniversaries, name days, the small private feast days that had accumulated year on year around the cottage and the manor and the village beyond. By 7, they were 6 in the small room, and the kettle was on for the 3rd time. And by 7:30, Narcissa had come down the gravel path on Andromeda's arm. Both of them slow now, both of them very upright, both of them in the high-collared morning gowns they had taken to wearing in identical cuts in their old age, as though the 37 years of silence between them were being privately repaid in cloth. And by 8, the south porch was full of voices, and the kettle had been retired in favour of the great brown teapot Molly Weasley had given them the year of the wedding, and somebody, somewhere, had begun to slice the cake. Hermione slipped out. She did this sometimes. It was not rudeness. They all knew it was not rudeness. She had always, since she had been a girl of 11 on a train to Scotland, needed 5 minutes alone in the middle of a crowd to gather herself back into one shape. And the cottage had been built, or so she had often privately thought, for precisely this purpose, with its small square of walled garden out the side door that nobody could see into from the porch. She stood there now in her dressing gown and her bare feet on the warm slate. The roses were everywhere. The garden was full of them. They were the only thing she had ever properly bothered to grow, and they had thanked her for the bother by taking over the entire walled square in 50 years of slow, patient sprawl. And she stood in the middle of them and breathed the warm honey and pepper smell of them, and watched a single bee move from one open flower to another in the unhurried morning. A footstep on the slate behind her. She did not turn. "You are not supposed to follow me out here." "I have been following you out here for 50 years. "Yes." He came up behind her. He put his arms around her. He set his chin lightly against the crown of her head. They were almost the same height now. She had not lost any inches, but he had lost a little in the way that very tall men do, and the difference between them was perhaps 2 fingers at most. And they stood together in the rose garden in the early sun and did not say anything for some time. A bee moved past their faces and was gone. 50 years, he said. "Yes, It does not feel like 50. No, it feels like the second Saturday in December, and you have just opened the antechamber door. It feels, she said, like the morning after, when the post owl came with my mother-in-law's letter, and you stood at the orangery window in your shirt sleeves and looked at me as though you had not slept, because you had not slept, and you said, "Let her," when I said your mother would have a fit. Let her. I have been hearing you say that, in different forms, for 50 years, Draco. Let her. Let them. Let it. You have given me, by saying that, my entire life. He turned her gently. He looked down at her in the rose-warmed light. He bent. He kissed her, slowly, the way he had kissed her in the conservatory at 3 in the morning, 49 years and 6 months ago. The way he had kissed her on the dais of the East Ballroom in front of 240 witnesses. The way he had kissed her at the altar of the Rose Garden 3 rooms from where they now stood. The way he had been kissing her, in one form or another, on every morning since. And the moonstone caught the sun on her hand where it had risen, almost without her asking, to rest against the place at his throat, where his pulse was slow and steady and warm. When he drew back, he kept his forehead against hers. "Come back inside, my love. Our family is waiting." "In a moment. Hermione." "In a moment, Draco. Stand here. A little longer." He stood. They stayed there in the rose garden, the cottage door open onto the porch, the warm, honey-coloured voices of 3 generations spilling out into the morning, the bees about their patient business in the open flowers, and the sun went on coming up over the south meadow the way it had been coming up for some 400 years. And the moonstone on her hand caught the light, small and cool and steady, the way it had been catching the light on one hand or another for the whole of a very long and entirely happy life.
So that was the story. I wanted to write something soft, something kind, a love story where the hard part is not whether they love each other, they already do. The hard part is the world around them, the letters, the whispers, the old names, the old fears. I think we forget something that loving someone is a choice, not once, every morning, for 50 years if you are lucky. Draco chose her, Hermione chose him, again and again, in small rooms, in loud rooms, in the rain, at a tea table, at 3 in the morning, in a glass house full of orchids. That is the part I wanted you to feel. If this story warmed you even a little, please leave a like, tell me in the comments who would you choose every morning for 50 years. Thank you for staying with me. I will see you in the next one.